Alright, YouTube, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about a storied franchise. We're going to be talking about a great action side-scroller. We're going to be talking about one of the greatest games of the 16-bit era. We're talking about Contra 3, The Alien Wars. Contra 3 The Alien Wars was released April 6, 1992 in the US exclusively for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. It was developed and published by Konami. You play as Bill Reiser, or Lance Bean if you're player 2, in the 27th century once again fighting against the evil alien organization Red Falcon, who has attacked Earth and sparked the Alien Wars. It can be played solo or cooperatively in some shoulder-to-shoulder run-and-gun action. At the time, Konami were the masters of the side-scroller. Along with Castlevania and Cybernator, this was one of their darker games. Like most Contra games, Alien Wars is fast, action-packed, and difficult. Once mastered, the game can be beaten in maybe 30 minutes. However, by the time you've mastered it, you will have put in dozens upon dozens of hours, also like its predecessors. There were some pretty big players behind Contra 3. Producer Kazumi Katawe went on to produce other big Konami titles for the remainder of the decade, including Castlevania Symphony of the Night and Metal Gear Solid, before going on to eventually become chairman and CEO of Konami. This was main designer and director Nobuya Nakazado's first Contra game, but it wouldn't be his last. He went on to either design or produce 5 more Contra games, including Contra Hardcore and Contra Shattered Soldier. You might say he's Contra's Shigeru Miyamoto or Hideo Kojima. Many of the Contra games made without him were typically panned by media and fans alike. There's a little bit of mystery surrounding the name of the series. The first game was released months after the infamous Iran-Contra affair. It's never been confirmed or denied that the game was deliberately named for the Nicaraguan rebels, which were also called Contras. It's interesting to note that the ending theme of the original game was titled Sandinista. The government that the Contras were fighting was, and still is called, the Sandinista National Liberation Front, the members of which are called, you guessed it, Sandinistas. Contra 3 drew heavily from its predecessors, and used many gameplay and design elements from them. The series has always been known for deriving much of its alien designs from H.R. Giger's Xenomorph and other pieces of his compendium, Necronomicon 4. Contra 3 is a strong example of this. Speaking of Xenomorph, the main characters' names, Bill Reiser and Lance Bean, are an amalgamation of the names of actors in James Cameron's 1986 film Aliens, which also starred the Xenomorph. And it was also one of the last Contra games to use 80s action movie poster art as a source for its own covers and advertisements. The game was tentatively called Contra 4 because Contra Force, for the NES, was intended to be the third installment of the series. Contra Force was called Arkhound in Japan and was ultimately cancelled, so it was rebranded as Contra Force and then released in the US almost a month after Contra 3. Contra Force takes place in 1992, and the only connection that it has is that it takes place in Neo City, which is where most of Contra 3 takes place. Speaking of Japan, it's often believed that the Japanese localization of the first game is called Grisor, but this is actually untrue. The actual kanji lettering used to spell out the title does not come out as Grisor, but as Contra, which is anglicized to Contra. So it's essentially referred to as Contra, just like in the US. The Grisor name comes from the PAL region release, which consists of Europe, parts of Asia and Africa, and Oceania. There, the various computer formats of Contra were called Grisor, and the NES version was called Probotector. In those versions, the main characters and many enemies were redesigned as robots because laws at the time prohibited portrayal of human-on-human violence in video games. The main characters were named RD-008 and RC-011 and were modeled after Briarios, a character from the Appleseed manga and anime. The Japanese and US versions were almost identical, except the Japanese version had some graphical enhancements and even some cutscenes. At the start of each level, a map showed your current position, and at the end of each level, Bill or Lance gave a brief report on their progress through walkie-talkies. Confusing? You just wait! There's always been a bit of confusion with the backstory and continuity in the series. This is because the first Contra game actually had a different setting and slightly different story depending on which version you were talking about. Put simply, the Japanese version was set in 2633. The main characters were Bill and Lance. The main antagonist was an organization called Red Falcon, led by a creature who's made up of two parts, a head and a heart. The head is named Emperor Demon Java, and the heart is named Emperor Demon Evil Heart Gomera Masking. Follow so far? Good. In the US, the game takes place in 1987. The main characters are Mad Dog and Scorpion, and the antagonist is an organization called Red Falcon, also led by a creature named Red Falcon. This creature shown here is often believed to be Red Falcon in North America. However, it's actually Jagger Freud, or Emperor Demon Gyaba in the Japanese version, the final boss from Super Contra. Contra 3 takes place in 2636 in both the US and Japan. The US version explained that the protagonists in Contra 3, Jimbo and Sully, are descendants from the protagonists in Contra. This has since been retconned, and the Japanese continuity is generally considered to be the official one. However, to further confuse matters, characters named Mad Dog and Scorpion appeared alongside Bill and Lance in 2007's highly praised Contra 4 for the Nintendo DS. That's not confusing at all. So in 1992, Contra 3 was released, as Contra Spirits in Japan and Super Probotector Alien Rebels in PAL regions. Contra 3 was actually one of the few select games for the Nintendo Super System, which is an SNES-based arcade cabinet, and was released on that before it made its debut on the SNES home system. Par for the course in the Contra series, the gameplay was fast-paced and notoriously difficult, but it was also fair. Player deaths were often attributed to mistakes made by the player and not by gameplay design. That is something all games should aspire to. For every generation of video games, Contra set the standard of gameplay for 2D action games. So in that sense, Contra is not unique because it's the trendsetter. Often imitated, never duplicated. The heads-up display is simple. In the top left corner, you have your remaining lives, your weapons, and your remaining bombs. Notice I said weapons, plural. More on that in a sec. Gameplay for Contra 3 is laid out in a level format. Like most 2D action games, the player moves from left to right, fighting various enemies along the way, finding weapons and other power-ups, and ultimately fighting a boss at the end. Like its predecessors, Contra 3 changes it up a bit by having a couple levels play from a different perspective, in this case, top-down. On those levels, the player must find bunkers spread throughout the map and destroy them. When that objective is met, the player then fights the boss at the end of that level. The player completes the game when he or she makes it to the final level and defeats the final boss. Like past Contras, the action is hectic yet controlled. Enemies have a predictable pattern and the player must flow to be successful. Getting caught up and messing up your rhythm often spells certain doom. It's because of this flow that two-player co-op mode is actually much more difficult than playing by yourself. Both players need to follow this flow. If one player lags behind or pushes too far forward, it'll cause the death of one if not both of them. Moreover, both players share lives from a common pool, so two players with a huge skill or experience deficit will have a difficult time progressing throughout the game. The weapons in the Contra series are iconic, and Contra 3 lets you carry two at a time, a series first. You can even fire both at the same time by holding down L and R and pressing fire. This is pretty cool, but it also can be pretty risky. If you die attempting this maneuver, you lose both weapons. Let's take a look at the tools you'll be using to fight the forces of Red Falcon. First is the barrier. The barrier is a simple shield that also made an appearance in both Contra and Super Contra. It grants the player with roughly 10 seconds of invulnerability. It's represented by a glowing blue-green circle around the player which turns red a few seconds before the shield disappears. Next is the machine gun. This is your default weapon and a great one at that. This is a huge step forward from previous Contra games. In those, the default weapon is weak in damage as well as visual and audio feedback, and it fires once every time you press the fire button, which means button mashing. I can't stand that weapon! Konami really turned it around with Contra 3. It's fully automatic, so you just hold the fire button down, and it has good feedback and decent damage. Next is a spread gun. This weapon attained legendary status from the 8-bit era. While it's still a great weapon, I'd argue it's no longer the best. Still, it suits the game very well and performs well in almost every scenario. Also making its return from the first game is the laser. To put it bluntly, this weapon is garbage. It fires very slowly and it's very precise. In a game with numerous swarming enemies, it just doesn't really work. It does have a couple of saving graces though. For one, you can carry 2 weapons, so you don't have to run around with it equipped, and you could use it in the few scenarios where it works. Secondly, and most importantly, the entire weapon dynamic changes in the top-down levels. On those levels, the laser has a godlike status. It's basically a lightsaber, mowing down everything in its path and even decimating the boss of that level. Next up's the flamethrower, another original from earlier titles and another weapon that was garbage in Contra 1 and 2, but totally rocks in Contra 3. Heavy damage but limited range, the flamethrower is unique in that it actually whips around, allowing you to fire in more than 8 directions. Just a great weapon. Next up you have the homing missile. The homing missile is the new kid on the block at this point in the series, but it does go on to become pretty iconic in its own right. This is probably the weakest weapon besides the machine gun damage-wise, but the ability to hit enemies without aiming at them more than makes up for it. It also has a very fast firing rate, which means it can acquire, destroy, and reacquire targets in quick succession. In a game like Contra, it's exactly what you want, since there's going to be lots of enemies coming from lots of different directions. Then there's the Crush Missile. This is my personal favorite weapon. It hits hard. The fire rate is slow, but the little explosion it creates lingers for a second, causing some extra damage. It's great for lone, tough enemies like bosses, but not ideal for numerous weak ones on account of the rate of fire. And finally, you got the M80,000 bomb. This is the screen clearer. It marks the first time in Contra history you can store and set off these bombs at any point of your choosing. It destroys all normal enemies on screen and heavily damages mid-bosses. Final bosses definitely feel the effect as well. Just don't hoard them, because if you do, if you die, you lose all but one. The 16-bit era was great for 2D action games. The powerful hardware of the SNES allowed for Contra 3 to surpass the graphics quality of even the arcade versions of Contra and Super Contra. The higher resolution allowed for detail that makes Contra 3 look great even today. The player, the enemies, the levels, the backgrounds, they are all beautifully drawn. It also allowed for advanced level interaction. The player can monkey bar his or her way across wires and ceilings and even commandeer tanks. The game even took advantage of Super Nintendo's Mode 7 graphics, which allowed for faux 3D effects. You can see this being used in the top-down levels. The design is dark and dreary. The ruined landscapes in the background and the heavy cloud coverage illustrate this well, and the alien lair towards the end of the game is grotesque. It is awesome. These are all staples of the series. The music is well done, but I'd argue it's a bit of a step back from earlier titles. The music for Contra on the NES is iconic, ranking right up there with Super Mario Bros. And Zelda. The music in Alien Wars does a good job of conveying the tone they were aiming for, but ultimately it's a bit bland. It will never be iconic, but it's well done nonetheless. The sound effects are also solid. Each weapon has a distinct sound, and the death screams are cool. The controls are perfect. Not only are they responsive, but they sit in the correct position that allow for you to fire, jump, and move simultaneously with zero issues. Moreover, you can fire in any diagonal direction without actually moving your character in that direction by holding down R whilst firing. This is a massive lifesaver and not utilized enough in action side-scrollers. All versions of localizations of Contra 3 were huge hits. It's often considered the best title in the series. It received very good to almost perfect reviews. Alien Wars was praised for its technical accomplishments as well as its gameplay. The only negatives at the time revolved around the game's difficulty. Now, 23 years down the road, it's typically panned only for its short length and simplicity. Personally, I think this is not only a great side-scroller, but a great example of what a game should be. I do wish it was a bit longer, as it's about 2 stages shorter than Contra on the NES, but this doesn't take away from its gameplay or replayability. Contra 3 has left a huge legacy. Not only has it turned out several sequels, but it's inspired many fan-based games and set a standard for the genre. In Contra lore, the Alien Wars were a pivotal moment in its timeline. This truly is the premier Contra game. Since Contra 3, there have been 9 more sequels. The series has been the go-to for action side-scrollers and has probably influenced hundreds, if not thousands, of games. As far as 2D action games go, you can't get any better than this. Controls are responsive and the action is intense and various with just the right amount of challenge. The graphics are top-notch and no corners were cut. The weapons and other sound effects are of great quality and they make sense. In terms of music, 2 or 3 tracks really stand out as being great. The others are good too, but they're just not 10 out of 10 good. They do the job. The presentation of Contra 3 is outstanding. The opening cutscene is awesome, as well as the epic backgrounds and between-level stills. It could stand to have perhaps a bit more cutscenes pertaining to story progression, and the game could be a bit longer overall. Replayability is above average. The main factor that drives this is the fact that you don't actually see the true ending to the game until you beat it on hard mode. This means many replays. After that, you're technically done with the game. However, since the gameplay is so stellar and it has such great pick up and play value, it's easy to keep coming back for more. Contra 3 has aged gracefully. Stack it up against any 2D pixel art side-scroller from today, and it holds up very well in art, design, and sound. It is a little bit short, like I mentioned before, and slightly lacking in the narrative department, however. In the end, I give Contra 3 The Alien Wars 9 out of 10. That's all, folks. Thank you very much for watching. If you like what you saw, hit like, hit subscribe, check out my other videos, and I'll see you next time.